org. Right now we go live to London, where the British House of Commons begins a week-long session of debate on the Brexit deal negotiated by Prime Minister Theresa May for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union.
To limit the grounds of appeal against decisions on planning applications that are consistent with a neighbourhood development plan and local plan and for connected purposes. I am moving this bill today to try to provide reassurance to those communities who spend considerable amounts of time and money producing a neighbourhood plan, that their work is valued, that it plays an important part in the planning system and in the determination of planning applications, and that together with the local plan produced by the district or borough council, it is a fundamental document.
Order. It is something of a discourtesy to the honourable gentleman, the member for Henley, who is moving his 10-minute rule motion. It might not be front and centre stage in the minds of all honourable and right honourable members, but it's extremely important to the honourable gentleman and to a lot of people. And whether people are interested in listening or not, they should do the honourable gentleman the courtesy of affording him a respectful silence. Mr. John Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That it is a fundamental document and that the effort made in producing it is worthwhile. In my own constituency, two more neighbourhood plans recently passed at referendum by 94% and 98%, showing how much they are valued by communities. This bill is to show that where a district and parish have taken control of the planning requirements of their area, that view is an important and determining one for taking applications forward. I do this having held the position of government champion for neighbourhood planning, and in that role I have been around the country talking to groups of parish councils and their members of parliament about why they should produce a neighbourhood plan. I'm grateful for the large number of colleagues who have supported this bill, far more than the 11 supporter slots available. In my own constituency, at a village called Sonning Common, the local community and district council are reported to have spent £90,000 defending the village's new neighbourhood plan against an appeal. The subject of the appeal was an application for 95 dwellings on a site located in the neighbourhood plan for just 26. Why this application was able to be taken to appeal is part of the reason for this bill. The application was inconsistent with the Sonning Common neighbourhood plan, and there were no mitigating circumstances otherwise. Local residents had worked very hard on the neighbourhood plan and indeed continue to do so. The question we have to ask is, why was the existence of the neighbourhood plan not sufficient? In order to set the scene for this bill, let me go back to what prompted me and the then Minister of Planning, the Right Honourable Member for Tunbridge Wells, to introduce neighbourhood plans in 2011-12. The starting point was the recognition that the previous system of taking parish views on applications into account by ticking one of three boxes was inadequate. The boxes were yes, no, and no firm opinion. As we live in a plan-led system, it was crucial that anything that replaced it was part of the plan-led system, hence a new plan, the neighbourhood plan. This has proved to be a much better way of crystallising local views of development. The neighbourhood plan becomes part of the local development plan when it is approved at referendum and thereby carries the full legal weight that the local plan does. It is not a NIMBY charter. The plan needs to conform with the strategic objectives of the local plan, particularly the housing numbers, which should be seen as a minimum figure, and they have in practice allocated some 10% more sites than originally detailed by the district or borough council. So far, around 2,500 communities around the country are producing a neighbourhood plan. A high number have already passed referendum, with North Korean-style majorities. Despite the work of the local plan expert group on which I serve, wanting to simplify the production of neighbourhood plans, it is a process which is becoming more complex and time-consuming for ordinary people to carry out. And I pay tribute to the volunteers who spend so much of their time putting these plans together. But there is a bigger problem with this which this bill seeks to address. Let me explain. Imagine you are a parish which has committed money and considerable amounts of time to producing a neighbourhood plan. You have been through the exercise of allocating sites. You may even have allocated more than you were told was appropriate by the District Council. A developer wants to make a planning application which falls outside of the neighbourhood plan. He makes that application. It is rightly refused as being not in accordance with the neighbourhood plan. Yet he is still able to put in appeal to the planning inspectorate. That appeal will need to be defended. It will require vast amounts of time from local people who put the plan together. It may require the services of a QC. It may require the services of other specialists depending on the nature of the defence. Like at Sunning Common, they and the District Council may end up having to spend around £100,000 on defending it. However, the chances of the neighbourhood plan being upheld are open to doubt. In other words, all that effort and all that money could be wasted. The question I'm always asked is why, when we have a neighbourhood plan, should the developer be allowed to make an appeal? So how does this bill work? Let me give 3 examples. First, we have the situation where there is a robust 5-year housing land supply in place, or indeed, where appropriate, a 3-year housing land supply, and a fully approved neighbourhood plan and local plan. In this case, a developer makes an application for development which is contrary to the neighbourhood plan and is earmarked for refusal on the basis of neighbourhood plan policy. In making its decision, the local plan authority decides first that the application is outside of the plan or contravenes a policy in it and refuses it. It also makes a formal decision which is published as a formal notice in the minutes of the planning committee that the application is contrary to the neighbourhood plan. In other words, that the neighbourhood plan holds sway. In this case, the developer would have no right of appeal, which would be withdrawal. In the second case, there is still a 5 or a 3-year housing land supply, but in reaching its decision, the local planning authority does not follow due process. It takes a decision about which there are legitimate processual errors. It is not possible to evaluate the significance or impact of those errors and whether that would ensure that the decision can be overturned or whether it would make no difference at all. In this case too, the finding of fact is the application is contrary to a neighbourhood plan. In this case, the developer would have to make an initial referral to the courts by way of judicial review of the processual issues, meaning that the bar for a decision was a high one in which he would seek leave to appeal to the planning inspectorate. It would be for the court to review the processual errors rather than the issue of fact. Finally, in the third example, there is no 5 or 3-year housing land supply in place, but the local planning authority still refuses the application. In this case, the rights of the developer to appeal the application to the planning inspectorate would continue as now. The effect of this would be multiple. First, it will send a strong message to developers that neighbourhood plans are to be taken seriously. I'm fully aware of one developer who has devoted considerable resource to undermining neighbourhood plans and regularly puts in objections to local planning authorities. The issuing of a notice by the local planning authority makes it clear that there is a finding of fact that the application is contrary to a neighbourhood plan. Second, it is only by doing this that we will return real democracy to towns and villages of this country as we originally envisaged in the Localism Act. It will have no bad effect on the housing numbers. As I said, neighbourhood plans provide for some 10% more housing than originally envisaged. It could even make it more attractive for towns and villages to allocate land for more houses, knowing that they will be protected from rapacious interests. Thirdly, it will also give towns and villages confidence that producing a neighbourhood plan is worthwhile and will be seen as producing a determinant for the planning system. Lastly, this can be seen as another step in the reform of the neighbourhood planning system, which has adapted to changing circumstances throughout. First, there was the Barwell ministerial statement, which reduced under certain circumstances, the housing land supply to 3 years. More recently, it has included changes to simplify the process for updating a neighbourhood plan. Lastly, it will encourage communities to prepare plans, including local district and borough councils, and to support neighbourhood plans. In the local plan expert group, we quote the then National Planning Policy Framework. that plans, and I quote, should be the key to delivering sustainable development that reflects the vision and aspirations of local communities. But we also commented that less than a third of the country was suitably covered. There are many examples of good practice in plan making. This bill adds to that stock of good practice.
Question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as other opinions say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Sir Oliver Letwin, Sir Nicholas Soames, Sir David Evanet, Nick Herbert, Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, David Hanson, Kevin Hollingray, Gillian Keegan, Victoria Prentice, Damian Moore, and Stephen Lloyd, and myself, sir.
As far as he could for where he has to get.
He did, yes. Well, he does always sit there. He wasn't being contrary, that's where he normally is.
John Howell.
Planning Appeals Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, the 25th of January 2019.
Friday the 25th of January 2019. Thank you. Order. The Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Holborn and St Pancras, has tabled a motion for debate on a matter of privilege which I have agreed should take precedence today. I must inform the House that I have selected the amendment in the name of the Leader of the House. To move the motion, I call Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move this motion in my name and in the names of the relevant spokespeople for the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, the DUP, Plaid Cymru and the Green Party. Mr. Speaker, the issue before this House on this motion is very simple. Has the government complied with the order made by this House on the 19th of November this year to publish the full and final legal advice by the Attorney General to the Cabinet concerning the EU withdrawal agreement and the framework for the future relationship? Yes or no? That order was binding. Mr. Speaker, on the 13th of November, I sought your advice on that issue, and you ruled in the following terms. The ruling I give is simply that the motion is effective. I have been advised thus. It is not an expression of the opinion of the House, it's an expression of the will of the House that certain documents should be provided to it. Yesterday, the government published a reasoned position paper. That was not legal advice. It simply described the deal. It was a synopsis. It was in the nature of an explainer having already been published when the deal was published. It was a long way from legal advice. The attorney made a statement to the House and then he answered questions.
Where is it?
But the government did not publish the full and final advice by the Attorney General to the Cabinet. Mr. Speaker, that is the long and short of it. The government is willfully refusing to comply with a binding order of this House, and that is contempt. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Attorney General as good as admitted it when he said, and I quote, "I wish that I could comply with the request of the House. But if I did, I sincerely believe it would not be in all our interests." And slightly later he said, "Although the House says I should disclose, I believe that the public interest compels me not to do so. I'm sorry." Mr. Speaker, that's a plea of mitigation, it's not a defence. I make 3 points about the government's position. First, as the Honourable Member for North East Somerset made clear yesterday, for the Attorney-General to say that in his view it's not in the national interest is not good enough. The Honourable Member for North East Somerset went on to say, and I quote, "When the government loses a vote, they must follow the will of this House under a humble address, according to all precedent. It is no longer a matter for the government to judge. It has been decided by this House, which is a higher authority." Mr. Speaker, my second point is this. If the Attorney-General feels so strongly about this matter that he is prepared now to put the government in contempt of Parliament for refusing to comply with the binding order, why on earth did he not vote against the order in the first place? Or anybody else on the government benches? That wasn't an oversight. The government knew very well what was being asked for. The Attorney-General must have known what was being debated and voted on. Yet it appears from answers given by the Attorney-General yesterday that he was not asked before that vote for his views on the wisdom of not voting against the order, nor did he offer any advice, directly or indirectly. Again, Mr. Speaker, I quote the Attorney-General, "I had no discussion with the Chief Whip on this subject. None was sought." Now, I don't doubt the Attorney-General's word for a minute, but really? Before that vote, nobody asked the Attorney-General's views on the consequence of not opposing the order. The truth is that the decision not to oppose the order was a political decision. Taken by the government because it feared it would lose the vote. Mr. Speaker, they didn't want the short-term humiliation of losing a vote, and the price of that was higher than voting against the order. And none of them did it. Mr. Speaker, that's not for the first time. I will in a moment. That's not for the first time. For months, the government has ignored Opposition Day motions, and now their tactic has got them into very deep water indeed. The government cannot come to this House and say, "We took a political decision not to oppose the making of the order to publish the full and final advice by the Attorney-General, and then we took a decision not to comply with that order, but somehow we're not in contempt of Parliament."
Sounds pretty contemptuous to me.
The third point I make, Mr. Speaker, is this, and it's about the government's amendment. It's about the government's amendment in the name of the Leader of the House, asking this House to refer the matter of whether the government's response fulfils the motion of the Committee of Privileges. Mr. Speaker, the short point is this. There is nothing to refer. A binding order was made, and the government is refusing to comply with it. The reality is, yet again, by its amendment, the government is simply playing for time in the hope that this ends up in the long grass until the crucial vote is long gone. So, Mr. Speaker, this motion is extremely important. It has huge constitutional and political significance. Bringing the motion is not something I have done lightly. On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, on the contrary,
Order. I don't need somebody yelling rather stupidly from a sedentary position, "Give way." The right honourable and learned gentleman will give way if and when he wants to do so, and that's the end of the matter, and the same will apply when the Leader of the House is on her feet. Let me just make it clear, these are extremely serious matters, and the public is entitled to expect that this debate will be conducted with courtesy. However long it takes, that is what will happen. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not taking the decision lightly because I understand the constitutional and political significance of this motion. On the contrary, we have raised points of order on a number of occasions about this order. We've asked urgent questions, and I have repeatedly urged the government to reconsider its position, both publicly and privately, making it clear of the consequence of not doing so. But the government has chosen not to do so. I urge the government now, even at this 11th hour, to think again, to stop, to pull back from the brink of being found in contempt of Parliament. This motion, Mr. Speaker, is a last resort. The issue before us is simple. This House passed a binding order. The government is willfully refusing to comply with that order. That is contempt of Parliament.
Order. Yes, the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman has very clearly completed his speech. The question is as on the order paper. To move the amendment, I call the Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom.
I beg to move the amendment in my name on the order paper. In responding to this motion, I want to start by thanking my Right Honourable and learned friend, the Attorney-General, for putting himself at the disposal of the House yesterday for over 2 hours to provide information about the legal impact of the withdrawal agreement. He did so with his characteristic candour and integrity. The use of this motion has happened very rarely in the history of Parliament, and I don't think any member of this House can be in any doubt that the information that the Attorney-General provided yesterday was a very frank assessment of the legal position. The questions posed by members on all sides addressed the key issues we must all consider on the legal effect of the withdrawal agreement. And my Right Honourable friend responded to all of those questions in a comprehensive fashion. Alongside yesterday's nearly 2.5-hour session, the government has also provided a 48-page legal commentary which sets out the legal effect of each part of the withdrawal agreement. The information provided to the House is the detailed legal position on the withdrawal agreement, and as the Attorney-General said to the House yesterday, he continues to be at the disposal of parliamentarians to answer further questions. I would therefore, in responding to the contempt motion before us today, urge the House to exercise caution in this matter. The issue at hand is not one of substantive content. As yesterday's questioning illustrated, there is no real dispute as to the meaning and legal effect of the withdrawal agreement, and the Attorney-General could not have been clearer about the legal position yesterday. In fact, Mr. Speaker, no honourable member could say in all honesty that the Attorney-General has done anything other than treat this House with the greatest of respect. There can be no question that he or the government has acted in a manner which is contemptuous of this House.
I'm very grateful to her for giving way, and she says that the Attorney-General answered with candour. Indeed, he did, because he made it absolutely clear that what he was doing when he said, although the House says I should disclose, I believe the public interest compels me not to, he made it absolutely clear that he was, quite deliberately, in contempt of this Parliament.
Well, the honourable gentleman, in my opinion, is not correct, and as I have just set out, the Attorney-General answered questions from all members with the most frank and clear possible legal position. So the issue we are debating today is the government's duty to protect law officers' advice, which is in the national interest. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to the leader for giving way. Does she share my disquiet with some of the sincerity spoken by the honourable and learned gentleman who opened the debate? The letter which he has tabled, calling for this motion, was signed and sealed by Thursday lunchtime yesterday. They clearly had on Thursday, I'm sorry. They clearly had no interest in what our right honourable learned friend, the attorney, had to say on Monday.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend that certainly this House needs to exercise some caution, and I would like to explain precisely why. The issue we are debating today is the government's duty to protect law officers' advice, which is in the national interest. This House has previously recognised the importance of the principle that information cannot always be disclosed. This is always guided by the need to protect the broader public interest. This is directly reflected in the Freedom of Information Act of 2000, brought in under a Labour government, which sets out a careful scheme for balancing the twin imperatives of transparency on the one hand and of safeguarding the public interest on the other. The consequences of not following those principles are obvious. The House might request, by way of a humble address, information that could compromise national security or which might put the lives of our troops in danger.
Obviously, parliamentary sovereignty and the duty of government to obey motions is extremely important to this House. But my honourable friend is rightly saying there's another problem of the confidentiality of legal advice, which Labour and Conservative governments also need as well. Isn't there a sensible solution to this, as opposed to this party political exchange at the moment, that the opposition agree to receive a confidential briefing on Privy Council terms, look at the documents, and have the attorney point out those parts which, in everybody's view, might damage the national interest, damage the negotiating position of any government of any party, and in effect agree to redact the documents, the politically embarrassing bits, which is what the opposition are after, and all the rest of it, they can come out. But with both these conventions, that the House must be obeyed and that the attorney's legal advice should be confidential, ought to be protected, and that's a possible way of reconciling this.
Well, I'm grateful for the advice of the Father of the House, but he will appreciate that the right honourable gentleman opposite wants all legal advice to be put into the public domain without any attempt at protecting the national interest whatsoever. And what he will appreciate, I won't give way for a while, the consequences of not following the principles of transparency on the one hand and safeguarding public interest on the other are very obvious. The House could request, by way of a humble address, information that could compromise national security. It would mean releasing information with no method for the House itself to review or assess the information in question before its full release into the public domain. It would not be possible under the humble address procedure to weigh up any potential consequences of such a disclosure. It is simply an irresponsible thing to do. Turning to the present case concerning law officers' advice. As this House is aware, this is the subject of very long-standing conventions which are enshrined in the Ministerial Code and recognised in Erskine May. Firstly, without the authorisation of the law officers, the fact that, or whether indeed their advice has been provided to government, should not be disclosed. Secondly, such advice must not be provided to those outside of government without the law officers' express authorisation. The purpose of these conventions are to provide the best possible guarantee that government business is conducted in the light of full and frank legal advice. This is a fundamental principle of the rule of law. If government knew that it might be forced to disclose the advice that it had received, it could seriously compromise the sorts of requests for advice that would be made, and it would totally impede the ability of the law officers and government lawyers to provide it. In turn, that would seriously compromise good government. This motion we're debating today would undermine these vital conventions, and it does so through the blunt instrument of the humble address, an arcane parliamentary procedure which until very recently was last used in this way in the 19th century. Moreover, there is real doubt about the ambit of the procedure. As I said earlier, it contains no mechanism by which information can be reviewed to ensure that its disclosure does not seriously harm the public interest. So in considering today's motion, honourable members must reflect carefully on this and on the potential consequences not just for this government, but for all future governments. As this House knows, the government has worked extremely hard to comply with humble addresses that have previously been passed. And we have also sought to do so in response to the current case that we're debating today, whilst at the same time taking steps to protect the national interest. The conventions that I've spoken about stand and endure because they respect the proper balance between the government and Parliament, and the principle that ministers should be as open with Parliament as it is possible to be, provided that disclosure of information does not compromise the wider public interest. We chip away at them at our peril. Today's motion is not in the interests of members, and it is definitely not in the national interest. What we break now may be very difficult to fix later. I turn now to the contempt motion itself.
Will the leader give way before moving on?
I'll give way.
I thank the leader for giving way. The leader has been commenting on the use of the humble address mechanism to compel the disclosure of information. We were told by the attorney yesterday this information would be prejudicial to the national interest. Isn't it impossible to debate openly in this House whether or not the information should be disclosed without knowing what that information is? And isn't it therefore more appropriate to make a decision about what may and may not be disclosed in some confidential tribunal analogous to a judge making that decision if a matter of disclosure arises in a court of law?
Well, again, my honourable friend points out the problem that the Right Honourable Gentleman's motion seeks for all information to be provided into the public domain without any ability of anyone on any side of the House to consider whether that would be in the national interest to do so. So I do want to turn now to the contempt motion itself. We recognise that concerns have been raised as to whether the government's response meets the terms and spirit of the motion agreed on the 13th of November. We consider that the spirit and intent of that motion has been fully complied with. As I said earlier, the government has now provided a 48-page paper setting out the legal effect of the withdrawal agreement, and the Attorney-General came to this House yesterday. Anyone present in the chamber for his statement and his subsequent responses to questions can be in absolutely no doubt that the Attorney-General gave a full...
Order. The leader must resume her seat momentarily. Mr. Russell Moyle, you are a very excitable denizen of the House. If you were on your feet, you would be entitled to express your views. When you are in your seat, you are not. I hope that basic rubric is now clear to you and will require no further explanation. The Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Anyone present in the chamber for the Attorney-General's statement and his subsequent responses to questions can be in absolutely no doubt that the Attorney-General gave a full and frank exposition of the legal position of the withdrawal agreement. I simply reject any suggestion that the Attorney-General has done anything other than treat this House with the greatest of respect. Turning to process, the motion before the House today seeks to find the government in contempt of Parliament without having taken the important prior step of referring the matter to the Committee of Privileges, as is normally the case. This is a matter of due process. Firstly, those facing this extremely serious charge of contempt should each be given the opportunity to make their case and to follow the due processes of this House. They should be given the opportunity to explain how they have come to their decision about how best to balance the government's responsibilities to Parliament with their ministerial duties, including the need to consider the national interest. That opportunity is a vital element of any such procedure. And in this mother of all parliaments, surely we are nothing if we don't uphold our own constitutional practices in the appropriate way. The Privileges Committee will also want to consider the question of compliance with the motion in its full constitutional and historical context. The Government would strongly welcome the committee having the opportunity to consider the more general scope of the motion for the humble address procedure, in particular as regards confidential information and the national interest. The committee could consider these complex matters in a full and impartial way, away from the heat of the present debate and in fulfilment of their parliamentary duty as established by this House. And I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, the Chair of the committee, for the conversation she and I had today where she agreed that her committee would be happy to consider that. The members of the committee are accustomed to the consideration of complex and contested issues. That is the very essence of their role. Although it would be for the House itself to reach a final determination on whether a contempt has been committed, it should do so on the basis of that full and impartial consideration of the facts by the Committee of Privileges. Therefore, I appeal to all of those honourable members right across this House that if they seek to pass this motion, they should refer it to the committee in line with our parliamentary procedures. And I urge all honourable members to support the Government's amendment.
Oh, no, the original question was as on the order paper. Since when the amendment has been proposed as on the order paper, the question is that the amendment be made. Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must say that I found the answers given by the Attorney General yesterday extremely difficult to understand in the terms in which they were expressed relating to the national interest, when of course that is a question which is contained in the results of the referendum and the Withdrawal Act of 2018. I also found it very difficult on reports that I've heard that it's most unsatisfactory for this issue to be regarded as a parlour game, that we were told to stop messing around with the process. I have to say, and to grow up, I have to say that I do think that that somewhat underestimated the significance of what we are here dealing with. But I will leave it at that, because people in those circumstances do use language which sometimes perhaps underestimates the importance of the matters that are being dealt with. On the question of conventions, I would simply like to say to the Leader of the House, and indeed to the law officers, that the question of conventions does turn on the reason for the rule. Now, in this particular context, I would simply say that the reason for the application of this particular convention, which includes the question of the ministerial code, which I shall come on to in a moment, quite clearly demonstrates that unless you know what the Attorney General has actually given by way of a full disclosure, it is extremely difficult to know whether or not the public policy which has been pursued is consistent with the legal advice that he gave. Ivor Jennings is one of the greatest constitutional authorities on these matters, also says that conventions are observed because of the political difficulties that arise if they are not. I would suggest that nothing could better illustrate the current situation, and in particular the issues which I am about to deal with relating to the ministerial code itself. Under the ministerial code, it is essential that the law officers are consulted in good time before the government is committed, and I use the expression set out in the code, to critical decisions involving legal considerations. Now, I've been informed, because the Chequers proposals lies at the heart of the beginnings of the issues with which we're considering the withdrawal agreement, that the law officers were not consulted before the Chequers proposals, with dire consequences, including, as I said to the Prime Minister on the 9th of July, that I didn't think she would be able to reconcile the Chequers proposals with the express repeal of the European Communities Act 1972 in the 2018 Withdrawal Act. Now, this was passed on the 26th of June. 16 days passed, and then we were presented with the Chequers proposals. So everybody knew when the Royal Assent was given that the express repeal of the 1972 Act had actually been enacted, and yet it was quite clear, because it was only a few days later, that a white paper of 80 pages was produced, the effect of which was to demonstrate that the 1972 Act was going to be considerably altered. And therefore, I regarded that as a massive breach of trust, which could have been resolved if we had the full advice of the Attorney General at that time, at that moment. Now, under the same convention, and with respect to this present withdrawal agreement, it is essential for us to know now whether the present Attorney General gave advice on the issue of incompatibility between the expressed repeal of that 1972 Act in the Withdrawal Act itself and the withdrawal agreement itself. Now, in the introduction that he gave to his legal statement yesterday, there is no indication that he addressed that question as a matter of fundamental constitutional importance. Indeed, it does state that the agreement needs a new Act of Parliament in domestic law. But as I pointed out in the Sunday Telegraph, this is no more than a wing and a prayer. I asked the Prime Minister about these matters during her statement last Monday, and also in the liaison committee, to which I received no satisfactory answers. I also asked the Attorney General yesterday a similar question, and I asked him to draw his own attention to a Queen's Bench division which was cited as a precedent for the disclosure of the Attorney General's advice. There are 4 other precedents, but factor tame is particularly significant because of the incompatibility between the 1972 Act and the withdrawal agreement. So what I'd say to you, Mr. Speaker, is simply this, that if we do not have the full disclosure of the opinion of the Attorney General, this is relevant to the question of whether or not the actual withdrawal agreement itself is invalid under the Vienna Convention, because a fundamental failure to comply with internal domestic constitutional law does amount to grounds for the invalidity of such a withdrawal agreement. And I would simply say, just one moment, I would simply say this, that if there is a danger of invalidity of that withdrawal agreement, this is a matter of fundamental importance on which I would have expected the Attorney General to include his opinion in relation to this withdrawal agreement. But there is no evidence whatsoever that he has referred to that in his opinion, and that is why we need to have its full disclosure. I also understand that there are, from within governmental circles, that there are sheaves of papers unpacking the repeal of the 1972 Act with respect to the prospective withdrawal and implementation bill, which again is a matter of extreme public importance. By any standards, all these matters fall not only within the ministerial code, but also within what I would have hoped and expected the Attorney General would deal with in relation to his opinion and the statements he gave yesterday, but there was nothing there to give me any comfort whatsoever. So I do think that to say that we should move on and that we should get real and that what he thought was in the national interest does also bear on the question of whether in fact the Withdrawal Act of 2018 is not a matter of extreme public interest and fundamental importance. And the failure to address that question in the introduction and in the legal statement does seem to me to be a mistake of the first order, and furthermore to be inconsistent with what I would have expected from the legal opinion of the Attorney-General. Could I just add this? As to the role of the Attorney-General, I simply refer to the authoritative work, The Attorney-General, Politics and the Public Interest, published in 1984 and written by Professor John Edwards. In his chapter dealing with ministerial consultations with the law officers, it is made clear that all the legal advisers from all departments in the whole of government ultimately will turn on the view of the Attorney-General. As he states, there will be times when the departments when the Attorney-General, perceiving the legal implications of a department's proposed course of action, in this case number 10 and the Department of DEXU, will find it necessary to oppose himself a minister's preferred policy. And such opposition must also derive from the legal implications of the proposed policy. For the government, he says in this authoritative work, to reject such advice would be quite exceptional and would reasonably lead to serious questioning by the Attorney-General himself of his continuing to serve as the government's chief legal advisor. That appears on page 190. Without full public disclosure of his opinion, it will be impossible to get to the bottom of all these considerations, which are at the heart of the issue of public trust, to which the Secretary of State referred regarding the manifesto of 1985 and the reasons for his resignation, and the conduct of the government, to which I have referred myself in terms of broken promises by the government in the House recently. I would simply add that the reason why my European Scrutiny Committee is making a full inquiry into this, in a nutshell, is this: that we want to get to the bottom of the conduct and the processes and the outcome of these negotiations, and we will do so by taking evidence, and I trust that the government will take note of the seriousness of the suggestions and the arguments that I'm putting forward, because they go to the heart of public trust, the referendum vote itself, the repeal of the 1972 Act, and also whether or not the Attorney-General has fully addressed, in an opinion to which we have a right, in my opinion, to see, the consequences for the withdrawal agreement of the opinion that he has given, and the question of whether or not it is really in the public interest for it not to be disclosed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by commending those honourable and right honourable members who have secured this debate, and thanking you for allowing it. Can I also pay tribute to the stamina of my honourable friend from North East Fife and others of my colleagues who last night assured that you would have ample time to consider the response to the original application. Mr. Speaker, later today, we begin 5 days of debate on possibly the most important peacetime decision this Parliament will ever take. Today also, Ofsted has described the government's treatment of thousands of vulnerable school children in England as a national scandal. We have a major investigation into the alleged profiteering with funeral companies. We've had reports from a UN Special Rapporteur and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation highlighting the appalling poverty that exists in this, one of the wealthiest economies in the world. What's that got to do with the motion before us just now, Mr. Speaker? Because the only reason that we are allowed to discuss those things openly and without fear, indeed the only reason we're allowed to know most of those things, is because the power of the state to stop us from knowing is tempered by the rights of a democratically elected Parliament. Not tempered nearly enough, in my humble opinion. The Parliament is not democratically enough elected, in my humble opinion. But we do have an elected Parliament to hold back on the excesses of the state, to hold back on the excesses of the government. And that is what today's motion is all about. A Parliament of 650 people, each one of us entrusted to exercise sovereignty on behalf of those who sent us here. A contempt of this Parliament is a contempt for the fundamental principle of the sovereignty of the people. A contempt for this Parliament is a contempt for the people. A government that seeks to place itself above the express will of this Parliament is a government in contempt of the people, and it is a government that has already taken a dangerous step down the road from democracy towards dictatorship. And today's debate is not about the rights and wrongs of the original motion as presented to the House on the 13th of November, because astonishingly enough, the time for debate on those questions was the 13th of November. So let's not spend time today on questions of convention and precedence, of confidentiality of legal advice, and of when that confidentiality should be waived. The time for that debate has gone. The time for opposition to the terms of that motion was when you, Mr. Speaker, called the question. And at that point, the government instructed its members to do nothing. The government instructed its members not to oppose that motion. I welcome the degree of humility they're shown in now admitting that they got it wrong. But the government having got it wrong is not an excuse for the government unilaterally to seek to change the wording or the meaning behind a decision, a binding decision that has been made by this Parliament. The government seem to decide that they can change that meaning. They've got the audacity to come back here yesterday and today and tell Parliament that they, and not Parliament, know what it was that Parliament decided and know what it was that Parliament meant when we took that decision. Mr. Speaker, they are placing themselves above Parliament. They are placing themselves in contempt of Parliament. And as for the legal position document published yesterday that was going to fix it all, that could hardly have been more patronising if they'd had pictures to colour in and rejoin the dots puzzles every so often just to keep us interested. It was not a legal position by any accepted definition of those terms. It was an attempted sop, possibly at some of their own MPs, who I know are in a very difficult position just now, struggling between their understandable loyalty to their government, to their party, to individual ministers, and their overriding loyalty to the people and to this Parliament. And as the Right Honourable Member for Holborn St Pancras has pointed out, the government have made a habit of not turning up if they think they're going to lose. Maybe the problem is they get so used to being allowed to ignore the views and the opinions of Parliament, they forgot that sometimes Parliament takes decisions that they are not allowed to ignore. Maybe that's why they're so upset now. Maybe it's because alongside the issues about what and should not be made available to members of Parliament or to the public, maybe it's because this decision has laid bare the incompetence at the heart of a government that doesn't even know the basics of parliamentary procedure. I'll give way here.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I'm just wondering if this commitment to openness now means that he will be asking the Scottish legal officer to publish all of her advice in the Scottish Parliament in future.
And the relevance of that in this debate.
Mr. Speaker, I have absolutely no doubt that if the Parliament that represents the sovereign people of Scotland gives a binding direction to the elected government of Scotland, the elected government of Scotland will comply with that binding direction. No such binding direction has been given. But let's not, Mr. Speaker, let's not try to deflect attention from the clear and blatant contempt that has been committed against this House with completely false accusations of contempt elsewhere. Mr. Speaker, we have a government who are behaving like a football team that doesn't turn up for friendlies if they think they're going to get beat. And then they discover they've missed a cup final and they've forfeited the tie with a notional 3-0 score. They're now back here not only being asked to be allowed to replay the final, but they're complaining that the score's void because the 3 notional goals would all have been offside if there had been anybody there to defend them. But Mr. Speaker, we're not talking about a game of football with trophies at stake. We're not talking about the sanctity or non-sanctity of the confidentiality of legal advice. We're talking about the most fundamental principle. We're talking about the most fundamental principle that governs our nations. The principle that Parliament can tell the government what to do, not the other way around. And this is not just some temporary individual aberration. It's part of a pattern of government attempts to keep Parliament out of this altogether, restoring sovereignty to Parliament by keeping Parliament out of its own sovereignty. They went to the Supreme Court to stop us having any say on the triggering of Article 50, and they lost. They did their damnedest in here to stop Parliament having any say in the withdrawal agreement, and they lost. They spent thousands of pounds of our money trying to stop a group of Scottish parliamentarians from finding out whether or not Article 50 can be unilaterally revoked. and they lost. The European Court almost certainly now will find that it can be. And I want to pay tribute to the parliamentarians from 5 political parties and 3 national parliaments who brought that decision to the court. I believe that what they have won will prove to be a pivotal victory. But it does raise a question that's too important to be treated as rhetorical, and it raises a question that's highly pertinent to the substance of today's debate. What kind of government goes to court to stop its own citizens from knowing that the government has legal powers but has chosen not to use them? What legitimate reason can there be for a government to want its people to believe that something is legally impossible when the government has already got its own legal advice telling them that it is perfectly possible? Mr. Speaker, I refer to this morning's preliminary opinion from the Court of Justice of the EU as simply another example of this government's attitude that the path chosen usually unilaterally by the government is the only one worthy of consideration, and that nobody is even allowed to know that other paths might be possible. They've got their priorities completely wrong, Mr. Speaker. They repeatedly tell us, and the Leader of the House said often enough again in her comments, that their ultimate duty is to act in the public interest. But in fact, we have a government that demands that Parliament and the public act at all times in the government's interests, and that is not the same thing at all. The government has taken on itself the right to decide what's in the public interest, not the Parliament that holds sovereignty on behalf of the public. The government declares itself to know better than Parliament what is in the public interest. The government places itself above the decisions of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the government places itself in contempt of Parliament. Early next year, we'll see the 370th anniversary of the day when a Crown King of Scots was executed just a few hundred yards up the road from here for defying the will, not of this Parliament, because this Parliament didn't exist then, but of one of its predecessors. Now, I don't think anyone's suggesting a similar fate for those who are found in contempt of this Parliament, but we should be under no illusions about the gravity of what we're discussing. And we should be under no illusions as to how the mockery from the Conservative benches is being perceived by those who believe that this Parliament should actually be allowed to tell the government what to do. The elected parliaments of our 4 nations, for all the faults and the flaws and the imperfections and the ridiculously outdated procedures and the arcane procedures that the Leader of the House sometimes doesn't like, represent the rights of our citizens. No one has the right to wield power over the people without the consent of the people. In a parliamentary democracy, that consent is expressed through Parliament, not through the office of the Prime Minister or any other holder of the offices of state. When Parliament speaks, it speaks on behalf of the people, and the government must listen. And when Parliament instructs on behalf of the people, and the government must comply. Mr. Speaker, Parliament has spoken. The government must listen. Parliament has instructed. It has not asked, it has not opined, it has not suggested, it has instructed. The government can disagree or moan or complain as much as they like, but they must comply with that instruction of Parliament. Instead, the government seeks to defy the instruction of Parliament. They seek to defy the sovereignty of the people as expressed through their elected representatives. And it is now, Mr. Speaker, for Parliament to take the only course of action open to us to compel the government to back down.
Nadine Dorries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll just make my apologies before I start that I do have to leave to chair the finance bill, and so I do have to absent the chamber quickly. I just want to begin my points, which I will make very short, by referring to the Right Honourable Member for Carl Shulton and Wallington, the Right Honourable Member, and comments that he made on the radio this morning when he discussed the Iraq War debate and the legal advice that was issued and what is happening now, and actually conflated the two, because of course the advice that was issued wrongly by the previous administration, which actually resulted in members in this House going into the lobbies misinformed and without the required information was about the legalities of the Iraq war, whereas this, as the Attorney General made clear yesterday, is a political decision, not a legal. No, I'm not going to give way because I have to go. I haven't got time. Sorry. Obviously, yeah. But
thank her for giving way. She's very generous. Can I just point out to her the only point I was making? The comparison was about the risk of cherry picking, and I don't think anyone would argue that the Iraq war and the position that was set out by Lord Goldsmith actually cherry picked that advice to maximise the government's position and to press its case.
I do believe that the two issues were conflated, and that this was used as a basis to argue that for the revealing of the legal information now on a wrong predication. I would just like to make that point. I'd also like to go on next to my point about the civil servants and the legal advice that the government receives. You know, Mr. Speaker, I have been in a quandary about this and about this vote today. I would like to see the full legal evidence, as I'm sure everybody in the House would. But there are conventions and also other people to consider, and civil servants fall into that category. They serve us all with true independence, absolute independence. And I don't know where any government ever would be in this place if we could not depend absolutely on the impartiality that we received, of the legal advice that we received from those civil servants. And if this motion is passed today, if this amendment passes today, what civil servant, what legal advisor would ever want to advise any government in the future without first putting in place a filter of self-preservation, of considering that advice that they gave? Who would want to do that as a civil servant? And I think, although I would love to see this legal advice, we have a duty to consider others, the people who serve both the public and us. I actually have 100% respect for civil servants. They work amazingly hard. They are truly independent. They serve us without any political bias, and I think that is something which should absolutely be considered. In terms of the public interest and the points the Attorney General made yesterday, you know, none of us know if there are any issues, apart from the Attorney General and the select few, none of us know if there are any issues in that legal advice which pertain to national intelligence, national security, or any other of those issues. And I only have to assume that when the Attorney General spoke yesterday about public interest, he was talking in the much broader context. And you know, Mrs. B, this is an important issue because in the course of law, and I think I'll just quote the Attorney General yesterday, there is no procedure by which this House can have redactions or entertain circumstances in which it could weigh the competing public interest against the interest of disclosure as a judge would do. Yes. Now, given what happened with the publication of the summary of the legal advice during the Iraq war, This inevitability that's happening today should have been foreseen then, because we live in a changing world. We live in a world where people demand transparency, where they have a right to know all the full information. Mr. Speaker, I believe that a resolution should have been passed in this House to give powers to this House, because after all, Parliament is a court, to give powers and a process in this House whereby this House, probably via your office, Mr. Speaker, through the authority of your office, via the clerks, via independent judicial advice, should be able to take a decision and redact matters of national intelligence and security from legal advice so that people in this House can see legal advice. And I hope that as a result of what's happened today, and given that it will happen again in the future, the demands to see legal advice, that the House will now take some cognizance of this and decide to pass a resolution that will ensure that we don't find ourselves in this position again. Also, I'd just like to go on and say, Mr. Speaker, that we have been told the worst as far as I'm concerned. The Attorney General pulled no punches. When he said there's nothing to see here, actually he told us what needed to be seen, and for me, I'll again quote his words. There is therefore no unilateral right for either party to terminate this agreement. This means that if no superseding agreement can be reached within the implementation period, the protocol would be activated and international law would subsist if negotiations are broken down. He told us the worst. We will be in the backstop in perpetuity. That was as bad as it gets. If we cannot withdraw from the backstop following the decision of this House, we are trapped, as somebody said from a secondary position yesterday. And I believe that no MP with any conscience, given with what the Attorney-General told us yesterday, could actually vote for the withdrawal agreement because he pulled no punches. He told us the worst it can actually be. And I commend him for that. And I want to finish, because I have to, with one with a comment about us. You know, I listened to the Right Honourable and learned gentleman for Holborn and St Pancras when he said those words at dispatch box. And one day, and I hope he's white in hair and long in tooth before he gets there, but he may be the Attorney-General. And his words may come back to haunt him at some time in the future. And I could see, I have watched him many times, and I could see that thought going through his eyes. As a legal advisor, formerly, to one of the most eminent law firms in the country, he knows full well when he stands at that dispatch box what he is saying and what he is doing. And I hope you never find yourself in the position that you have put our Attorney General in. And I would like to finish, Mr. Speaker, with this.
I don't quite understand why the Honourable Lady thinks that someone of my limited capabilities aspires to the high office of Attorney General. Nadine Dorries.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Let's have it all then.
And I should know better. I should know better. I apologise. I would like to finish with this, that we are all, before we are Attorney Generals, before we are Mr. Speakers, before we are French bench spokesmen, we are all MPs, we are all elected members. And I believe that both the Attorney General came to this dispatch box yesterday in both honour and in good faith and was honest. And the result of what will happen today, if this amendment is passed, that the integrity and the reputation and the honour of a good man will be traduced. And that will be a disgrace of this House to do that, because any one of us may one day be in that position. And God hope that it does not pass today for that reason.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady, the member for Mid Bedfordshire, and I don't agree with the main thrust of what she said, but she did make some very, very useful and pertinent comments about what the Attorney General said yesterday in terms of the analysis of where we find ourselves. I agree with her and other honourable and right honourable members who have praised the Attorney General and his candour and his honour and what he has brought to this House yesterday in terms of more truthfulness, if I can say, about what this deal actually means, in contrast to others who have been prepared to say things to the press and media. He came here as a member of the Cabinet and told us some of the unvarnished truth about this agreement. So I do praise him for that and join with the Honourable Lady in what she has said, because when I went through the adjectives that he used in his devastating commentary yesterday about this deal being a calculated risk, unattractive, unsatisfactory, undesirable, that it did provide no unilateral exit clause for the United Kingdom, it was indefinite, no unilateral right to terminate. But he asked us to take it on trust that it would all never happen, because, believe it or not, having spent 18 months negotiating all of this, the EU and the Irish government don't actually want to implement any of it. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that despite all of the candour and all of what was said yesterday, the coming to this House and making, yes, 2.5 hours of an oral statement and taking all the questions and providing the reasoned position paper does not actually fulfil the order, the motion that was passed by this House, which was for the final and full advice provided by the Attorney-General to the Cabinet to be published. Now, the Government may not like the fact that this was passed by this House, but it cannot simply wish it otherwise. During the course of the debate on the 13th of November, it argued that it would do precisely what it has now done. That was rejected by the House. The House passed a different motion. And it is not good enough now for ministers, and it's not particularly the Attorney-General we single out, because he said himself in a statement yesterday that he wished that he wasn't in the position that he was in. But it is the government as a whole which is collectively responsible for deciding that it will simply ignore this binding effective motion and revert to doing what it said it would do during the debate. Well, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, that cannot be allowed to stand. We've heard a lot of talk about precedent and about conventions of this House and respect for all of that. Well, surely this is one area where the government must respect the will of Parliament and simply cannot set it aside. The Father of the House, in his intervention earlier, made a very interesting and I think a positive contribution about a way round this. But it's interesting that the government didn't take that up. It didn't take it up during the course of this debate, and it hasn't taken it up previously. So clearly the government isn't interested, it appears, certainly hasn't said anything publicly up to now about taking that suggestion forward. What it has done is say, no, it doesn't matter what is said by this House, doesn't matter what other suggestions are out there, we are going to stick to the plan. They obviously have a grid somewhere where this is on the plan, that they will publish this reasoned summary position paper and have a statement, and that is it. Mr. Speaker, this House will have the final say, and I hope that it will reiterate what it has previously ordered on the 13th of November to be done. Now, we're told that this is unprecedented. There are, of course, it was said in the other place yesterday, that in exceptional circumstances, advice like this can be published. I've also heard the argument used that this is privileged. But of course, privilege in the lawyer-client relationship belongs to the client, not the lawyer, not the person given the advice. The lawyer has a duty to protect the client's privilege, but the reality is that if the client waives that, then the lawyer, the provider of the advice, is quite at liberty to disclose. So this argument about privilege is a bogus argument. The Attorney-General says that he would wish to come out. The Attorney-General said yesterday, and the Leader of the House, I wish I could comply with the order of the House, but it's not in the national interest, not in the public interest. I'm afraid it's not the duty or the job of any government minister to decide that. The House has decided what it wishes to do, and it's not for a government minister to unilaterally override that with no good reason. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
The right honourable gentleman is very kind to give way. He's a patriot, and I know that he therefore understands national security and the national interest. Would you agree with me, however, that quite probably within the legal advice that the Attorney-General gave to the government would have been an analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the Irish government's position? And does he agree that to publish that in full would actually hand to the Irish government an advantage in any subsequent negotiation?
I'm tempted to say to the honourable gentleman, I think the massive advantage to the Irish government and other governments and to the European Commission is handed over in this withdrawal agreement in terms of future leverage over the negotiations. But I don't accept what he says, because the Attorney-General went on record yesterday as saying that there was nothing to see. Nothing to see here, so there obviously is nothing of concern about national security in this. That's what he said himself. So I don't accept what he has said. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, that had the government, this debate was had on the 13th of November.
That's right.
The government had the choice to vote against and decided not to vote against because they feared that they would lose the vote. And it cannot be the case, that by abstaining from a vote on a humble address, that invalidates the motion. because that would be a very, very serious precedent to set indeed. So, Mr. Speaker, we have had the situation where some of this legal advice, as given by the Attorney to the Cabinet, and it's that advice that is crucial that we must have, has already been leaked by members of the Cabinet to the press and media. And the Attorney General, I think, accepts that.
He shrugs his shoulders.
So the reality is that members of the Cabinet have already released some of this advice given by the Attorney in terms to the Cabinet to members of the press and media. I think that the Attorney is somewhat stopped, if I may use a legal phrase, from saying that the rest of us, therefore, are not entitled to have that. I think if some members of the select media and press are entitled, then I think the members of this House are entitled to have this advice. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Will you remember agree with me as well that if the government and the Prime Minister is going around the country trying to convince the populace that this is a good deal, that this approach, this secret approach, only confirms in people's minds that there is something to hide. And in fact, if anything, the government is scoring an own goal by refusing to publish this advice.
I thank my right honourable friend, and indeed that very point about the government actually scoring a massive own goal in its own terms has been made not from these benches but by a former cabinet minister on their own side and by many honourable members on the government benches. So the right honourable member sums it up for you. What is there to hide, given that the Attorney has said there's nothing to see, given the fact that we have the clear motion passed in terms by this House? It is absolutely vital now that that is enforced and the bogus arguments against it are rejected.
Thank you. Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that members of the public coming in to watch our debates would necessarily appreciate our role as the High Court of Parliament, but that is what we are. And by virtue of history, we've been given a whole range of powers enjoyed normally only by others of Her Majesty's courts, by which we both regulate our affairs, maintain our own privilege, which also means by virtue of the Bill of Rights of 1689 that we can't be impugned in any other court, and have coercive powers for dealing with those who transgress in front of us. And that can include government ministers. The difficulty we have, I have to say, from having served on the Standards and Privileges Committee and also been a law officer, is that our powers are entirely archaic, almost completely unusable, and in many cases are so old-fashioned and antiquated that any attempt at using them would probably run foul of most modern principles of justice. And I'm afraid that this situation has been allowed to prevail for decade after decade by a mixture of a failure of the House to grip the problems it faces and, of course, the happy complacence of government that has known that in reality the teeth are not really present for this House to assert its authority. And nowhere do we see this come to a head more than with this issue. It's all very well criticising the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, that the instrument he's used is a blunt one, but there are only blunt instruments to be used. And he was fully entitled to table the motion he did and to seek from the government the documents that he wanted. And the government chose, I have to say slightly to my surprise, Mr. Speaker, not even to oppose the motion, even though there were compelling arguments that could be presented, and indeed I can continue to be of that view, that the law officer's advice should not be published because it undermines the ability to provide proper confidential advice to government. That said, Mr. Speaker, the method that was adopted, and it may simply have been because of the speed with which the drafting took place, was undoubtedly very blunt. Given its ordinary meaning, the humble address, as I interpret it, extends not just to the Attorney General's advice, but to every advice that was provided to government during the course of the 2.5 years of tortuous negotiations with the EU, provided through the civil service at any time about the development and impact of the withdrawal agreement. I have no doubt that most of that is unlikely to be of great relevance to what the House wanted to see, and moreover, some of it may undoubtedly contain confidential material which, if put in the public domain, could well jeopardise the national interest. When I don't suppose, just to take an example, that this House would seriously contemplate requiring the government, for example, to disclose the name of agents working for MI5 or MI6. But you have to face the fact that this House does have the coercive power to make such a request. And this highlights the untrammelled nature of its sovereignty, but also the extent to which it can be open to abuse. In fact, during the course of the debate, the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, I think became aware that the terms of the motion were rather widely cast, because he restricted them at that point to seeking the final and full advice by the Attorney-General to the Cabinet concerning the terms of any withdrawal agreement. I simply make this point. Having been a law officer and supplied advice to government, it may surprise the House a little, but I've simply no idea if there ever was a final and full advice of the kind that was identified, because in my experience, the advice provided by law officers comes in a continuous stream of dribs and drabs, which by letter to the relevant department and to the Prime Minister, and if necessary to the Cabinet, touches on a multiplicity of things without necessarily being drawn into a whole. So I have to say that what is being sought here is about as easy to measure as the length of a piece of string. It is not at all clear what it is that the motion is seeking to grab onto, although I do accept that insofar as the motion is seeking to acquire the original documents of some of the advice that was provided, it is manifestly clear that it has not been complied with. That is apparent. Now, faced with that problem, where should the House go? Of course, within this House, there are going to be differences of view. The government wishes to protect its position, and the Right Honourable Gentleman and all those on the opposition benches, and indeed some on my own benches, who wish either to embarrass the government or just want to see this information, are going to be profoundly dissatisfied. The question of the culpability of ministers is in any case not uniform. If I say this in defence of my Right Honourable and learned friend, the Attorney-General, he is not a member of the Cabinet, although he attends Cabinet, and as the point has been made, he's covered by legal and professional privilege about disclosing the advice he provides to his client. The one person who cannot be blamed for this mess is him. He came along to provide as best an explanation as he could yesterday, but the fact is he is not responsible for making the decision as to whether the documents that the House wants are disclosed. I assume that may have been a collective decision of the Cabinet, although knowing the way the Cabinet works, I'm not even sure that that's necessarily the case. It may be an individual minister, or it may indeed be my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. But whichever it is, this also emphasises the blunt nature of the instrument, which is then reflected in the motion that has been brought before the House today. Now, it may be seen to be getting the government a little off the hook, but referring this to the Committee of Privileges is not a stupid course of action. I'm afraid I can anticipate a little how it's likely to progress, because the Committee of Privileges in its session will immediately come to the awareness of just how complex and bedeviling this entire area is because of the lack of clarity of both our standing orders and the processes of this House. But to simply go ahead without doing that, and to move to a statement of contempt, and I'm not quite sure, and it hasn't really been explained, where, if that is passed, we proceed next, does seem to me, on balance, and I say on balance because I have sympathy for the position of the Right Honourable Learned Gentleman, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, on balance seems to me to be the better course of action. But I acknowledge that on the face of it, we have processes in this House, and if this House is to work properly, they ought to be capable of being met. But what this highlights over and over again for me, and has done for many years since I came in here, but particularly since I became after I was a law officer, is that our processes and powers bear no relation to the real world in which we have to operate, and that as a consequence they can cause serious injustice. And that is something which all of us should be very careful about preventing.
Mr. Tom Brake.
Speaker, could I first of all start by perhaps praising the Attorney-General for spending over 2 hours answering questions, but could I perhaps gently also chide him for the manner in which occasionally his style of delivery descended rather into vaudeville. Finger-pointing, faux bonhomie and expansive arm gestures may work in court, but perhaps he might like to leave those at the bar of the House. Now, the Leader of the House referred to an arcane procedure, and others on the other side have referred to us on this side playing parlour games. Now, the arcane procedures and the parlour games that the honourable members opposite are referring to are about holding the government to account on a matter of contempt. So arcane they might be, but clearly they are essential as well. And members will know that Parliament's Bible, Erskine May, makes it very, very clear that the government's actions are in contempt. Their refusal to release the advice is an act which impedes the House in the performance of its functions. And what could be a more important function for this House than to have the full legal advice on Brexit, so that in the decisions we are going to take in the next week or so, we are able to take those in the full knowledge of the impact of Brexit. And that is why we are here today. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, I wrote to you on the 28th of November and subsequently signed the joint letter raising this issue of contempt. Now, the government came forward with a reasoned position paper, and I think the member for Beaconsfield did a good job of explaining quite how complex and extensive the legal advice is that the Attorney General will have received. But I suppose that rather did reinforce the point that the Attorney General producing a synopsis of said extensive legal advice spread over much correspondence does run the risk of perhaps presenting that synopsis in a way that is most advantageous to the government. And in relation to the intervention from the Honourable Lady Member for Mid-Bedfordshire, who is no longer in her place, the only point I was making again, and I'm very happy to get it on the record again, in relation to the advice about the Iraq War, is that clearly that was advice that was cherry-picked, massaged and presented in a way that reinforced the government's case. And that is the only comparison that I'm making, with a possible risk of the government unintentionally perhaps doing exactly the same thing in relation to the full legal advice that ministers have seen, and indeed ministers have leaked. And while a reference was made to that, I think the Attorney General simply shrugged his shoulders, as if leaking that advice selectively to the media from the government is something that is perfectly normal and acceptable in the daily course of government business. So we know what happened in relation to that advice about the Iraq War. And as for the government's amendment, we know clearly what the purpose of this is. Even with undue alacrity, the prospect of the Privileges Committee addressing this before the 11th of December is precisely nil. So in terms of us having clarity and guidance and a direction to the government, we're clearly not going to get that before the 11th of December. And I must say that I suspect that is what the government's motivation is for pushing that particular amendment. And of course, this is a pattern of government unwillingness to allow members of Parliament to have access to the legal advice that we need to take the decisions that we need to take here. And the Article 50 case is a very good example of that, where the government have repeatedly refused to say whether Article 50 is revocable, hiding behind the fact that they're not going to seek to revoke it, so Parliament doesn't need to know. Well, I'm very pleased that the Advocate General today has given a recommendation. It is only a recommendation, one that is very likely to be adopted by the Court, that makes it very clear that Article 50 is revocable. And for members of Parliament here, who next week are going to be taking votes where it is critical for us to know whether that is the case, in other words, if a people's vote is secured and at the end of that campaign people vote to stay in the European Union, we have a means of revoking Article 50 to bring that into effect. Very happy to give way.
On that point, does the honourable member believe that the Attorney-General gave advice to the government on the revocability of Article 50 and has hidden that advice from this House? And that is why we haven't had that disclosure.
All we know for a fact is that a number of members of Parliament, including, I suspect, the Honourable Gentleman, have repeatedly asked the government to confirm what their position on that is, and they've not been willing to do so. And that's why I think on these benches we very much welcome the fact the European Court will resolve this matter in the next couple of weeks. Just on that issue of Article 50, I did want to thank the member for Edinburgh South West for leading that charge, along with other members of the Scottish Parliament, and indeed also the member for Nottingham East, who is not, I think, in his place today, who has joined me in perhaps a supporting cast role in relation to the leading role that the honourable member for Edinburgh South West played in relation to that case. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy to give way.
Can I just say to the honourable member, I'm really pleased that he and my friend from Nottingham and the member for Edinburgh took the risk of taking this case to the court to establish an important principle, and that if the decision now is in line with the advice that is being given, then I think that is in the interests of the democracy of this country, and I think we should register our thanks to him and the other members.
Thank you for registering the thanks for me. I thank the honourable gentleman for that. But I think the critical point, for instance, for members of Parliament here to know is that, for instance, if we go beyond the 21st of January without a deal, and we start going down the track of no deal, that it is open to this House, it is open to this government to revoke Article 50 to avoid a catastrophic exit from the European Union. Knowing that is something which I would argue, and many members on this side have argued, we're entitled to know, and it's remiss of the government to have kept that information from us. But just to conclude, Mr. Speaker, I knew that would cause a celebration on the opposition benches, so for that I will speak for a little bit longer than I had intended. Mr. Speaker, I accept that this is not a simple choice that members have to make today. I accept that. Publishing the full legal advice has serious implications. Of course, I accept that, and I think everyone on these benches accept that. But the ramifications of the government ignoring the express demand of Parliament are of an even greater import, and that is why I urge members to vote for the motion today.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Mr. Speaker, I think we need to start with why parliamentary privilege is so important, particularly those of us on the government side, because there will come a time when we are not on the government side, at which point the protections provided for us by parliamentary privilege are all the more important, and that governments who run roughshod over parliamentary privilege when they are in government find that when they are in opposition, their position is much harder to defend and uphold. When the Conservatives were in opposition, we disliked the streamlining of parliamentary procedures that made it easier for the then government to get legislation through, because we found it harder to have the full debates, the full discussion that we wanted, the ability to discuss and sometimes even delay things which we were deeply opposed to. And that was a loss to us in opposition, even though a benefit once we were back in government. And my right honourable friend, the Lord President of the Council, mocked the humble address procedure on the basis that it was ancient. But every morning when we come into this House, when we pass through security, We are exercising a right that dates back to 1340. Whether you have your pass on you or not, you are entitled to come into this house, and nobody is entitled to obstruct you. And this is an important right because in times less benign than ours, people have wanted to obstruct members coming into Parliament. And we sit in a house where there is a very slim margin. And it may be that rushing back for a division, perhaps a division of confidence in the government, somebody obstructs you coming in, but that would be a breach of your privilege, and though it is very ancient, one of our most ancient privileges, it is actually a great safeguard of the proper democratic operation of this House. And we heard from the Treasury bench and from other right honourable members a very good argument for why the humble address should not have been passed in the first place. But today is the wrong day for that debate. That debate should have been held on the 13th of November and voted on or not, according to whether or not it were the will of this House for the humble address to go through. And the tradition of humble addresses is very clear, that the humble address is followed. Now, that does not mean that this House is irresponsible in passing humble addresses. We have heard suggestions that we might seek information from the security services. This House has never passed a humble address of such an unwise kind. And though I am not, dare I say, the greatest admirer of the socialists opposite, I accept that they are responsible enough not to wish to endanger the security of our nation. But that Parliament has the power does not mean that Parliament will exercise the power. Indeed, and importantly, this House constrains its right of free speech in relation to the sub judice issue. We have passed standing orders, and we give power to Mr. Speaker to stop honourable and right honourable members breaching the sub judice rule to ensure that the system of justice in this country proceeds properly. Likewise, we are entitled to limit the means of humble addresses and the information that can be received from a humble address. But we did not do so before the 13th of November. And therefore, what happened on the 13th of November ought to be complied with. Because if we simply say that motions of this House, according to great antiquity and precedent, can be ignored because the government feels like it, then what is this House here for? How are we protecting the rights of the people we represent? How are we able to seek redress of grievance? And the fact that it might have been unwise, indeed, had there been a division on the 13th of November, I would have voted against revealing the Attorney General's information and advice to the government. I did not think the humble address was well advised, but the government decided to accept the motion. And having done so, it was not then up to the government to say that it was not in the national interest to do so. I'm afraid that is a classic confusion. The government interest and the national interest are different things. The government interest is a political interest. The national interest is a higher interest. And in my view, the national interest is better served by respecting the privileges of Parliament than the convenience of the law officers. And therefore, in the national interest, not the government interest, this legal advice ought to be produced because Parliament has said so. And this is clearly a right that this House has. Every select committee has the delegated right to send for persons and papers. And this is simply an exercise by the whole House of requiring that papers be produced. But the government, with its majority, perhaps a majority it cannot always achieve, but at least with a technical majority, thanks to our friends in the Democratic Unionist Party, the government with its majority ought to be able to stop any papers it believes too confidential from not being produced. And indeed, it is still open to the government to bring forward a motion suggesting that the previous motion be overturned, and there is precedent for overturning an humble address and seeking to do the opposite. So there is a proper process for the government to follow if it does not want to release these papers, rather than sticking its feet in the mud and saying no. So then we come to the motions before us today. And here I agree with my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield, that I don't think the motion before us actually works, because it is too indistinct about who it is criticising, that it is criticising ministers broadly rather than the ones specifically concerned. And I think the motion needed to be more specific on who it was objecting to, who it was holding in contempt, and indeed ought to have used the rights that Parliament had to inflict some punishment on the person who is deemed to be in contempt. Yes, of course, I give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. If he feels as he has described, why didn't he put down an amendment to my right honourable friend's motion, setting out the position as he thinks it ought to have been done?
Well, I'm very grateful to the right honourable lady for her intervention, because the government has put forward an amendment that I feel that I can support, though we're not the pantomime season quite yet. All right, I give in on that one, Mr. Speaker. I am defeated on that particular point, but not on the substantive one. That I am happy to support the government's amendment, because I think it is right that a committee of this House looks at the issue in broad terms, because it may be right that the House wishes to take a self-denying ordinance on the extent of humble addresses. It may be that we would like to say specifically that they would be deemed disorderly and therefore not brought forward if they related to matters concerning the security services or other types of information where there would be a broad consensus that those matters should not be brought forward. Dare I say, the ability to demand papers could require that the tax return of honourable gentlemen and ladies opposite be brought forward to the House. Mine would be of so little interest I can't imagine it happening. But that would be a clear abuse. That would be a clear abuse of the precedents that we have. So it may well be right that the Privileges Committee should consider broadly how humble addresses should be used to ensure that they are effective. Because currently they ought to be effective, the government ought to abide by them. But there is one... Yes, of course I'll give way.
As ever, following his remarks with a great deal of interest, he will know, since he's an expert on Erskine May, that at page 168 from memory, it says very clearly that the humble address should not normally be used on matters that touch directly on bills before Parliament, as this clearly does. So was the humble address being used correctly in his view or incorrectly?
I'm sorry to say that my honourable friend isn't quite right. There is not a bill before Parliament on this issue. There is a motion before Parliament on this issue, and those two are clear separate matters, that they are not to be confused. And I have no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that had an humble address been brought forward on a bill before Parliament, it would have been ruled disorderly and therefore would not have been a subject for debate. And for the benefit of the Hansard reporters, Mr. Speaker is nodding, and therefore I hope this can go into the record as an authoritative reply. There is one concern I have about the reference to the Privileges Committee, and that is, of course, that the Attorney-General is himself a member of that committee, though a non-voting and a non-adding to quorum member of it. And I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
Officers would recuse themselves from any such meetings.
Well, I'm extremely grateful because...
Just speak into the microphone. The vast majority of members haven't got the slightest idea what she was saying.
I'm sincerely sorry, Mr. Speaker. The law officers would recuse themselves from any such meeting.
I'm extremely grateful for that. That gives me complete confidence in supporting the government's amendment. But I would absolutely reiterate that however the vote goes today, the humble address must be obeyed unless overturned, and for the government to fail to do so would not be treating Parliament properly. And on these benches, we must remember the great need for us, when we are in power, to defend the rights of Parliament for those occasions when we will not be.
Thank you. Geraint Davis.
Mr. Speaker, the question before us is whether there is information that was in the legal advice that is relevant and pertinent to the crucial question we must ask ourselves in voting on the withdrawal agreement. And against that, the government has suggested that there's security and national interests to defend that. And I put it to you that in the motion before us, it says that we should provide the final and full legal advice provided by the Attorney General to the Cabinet concerning the EU withdrawal agreement and framework. And that doesn't imply every email and every jot that's required. And certainly it seems to me that in terms of national security and national interest, that isn't a great risk. The question really is there a reason to believe that critical legal advice has been withheld? And I suggest that there is that reason, and I put it to the Attorney General yesterday, following advice from Council in two chambers, that in essence, the EU Withdrawal Act, in essence, gives the Prime Minister the right to submit Article 50 based on an advisory referendum. But if that referendum has been found to be conducted illegally and subject to cheating and lying, then the advice is flawed, so the notice should be withdrawn, and we've heard from the Advocate General that in all probability it can be withdrawn. Was this advice tendered or discussed by the Attorney General to government? Well, he didn't mention it at all, and yet it is advice that is available. So it suggests to me that, in fact, the advice that has been given to this House is incomplete for us to make those conclusions. In terms of this argument about whether the government now should basically revoke Article 50 on the basis that the advisory referendum was flawed, the argument in short is that we already know that the Leave campaign misled the country during the referendum, firstly, either deliberately or not. Secondly, that multiple investigations by the Electoral Commission have found that the Leave campaign broke campaign finance law. Thirdly, that had those offences committed by the Leave campaign been committed in a general or a local election, then that result would have been legally void. Fourthly, that the government has a legal duty to take all relevant considerations into account when making a decision, and therefore the fact that the referendum result would have been void due to one side's illegal conduct in any other election is a relevant consideration when deciding whether to give effect to that result. That is, in ratifying the withdrawal agreement, which will give Brexit effect. In essence, then, the advice on the withdrawal agreement the Attorney General should have considered would be whether the government was failing in its duty by promoting the agreement when the animating factor of the agreement, the referendum, was so fundamentally compromised. Therefore, the government is there acting illegally by moving forward with Brexit without giving proper consideration to these facts. Now, this whole debate and discussion wasn't included, whether one agrees with it. This is a discussion that would have occurred within the ambit of the Attorney General that we don't know about. And this is a key reason to believe that the advice being given has been doctored for party political reasons, and we need the full and latest advice. We've just heard that the Advocate General is saying that Article 50 may be revocable. What is the view of the Attorney General given in the legal advice to the government? We haven't been told. I'll take the intervention in a moment. The point I'm trying to make is the Attorney General must be aware of these points of law, and so and hasn't elicited these points of law, and so we must conclude he's withholding from the House relevant issues, not for the national and public interest, but for party political reasons, and therefore is in contempt of this House. I will take an intervention.
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman giving way. He makes very serious allegations in what he's just said. Does he not recognise the importance of legal professional privilege and the privilege that attaches between a lawyer as an advisor and their client?
Well, of course I do. And the whole point here is that this House is entitled to the full legal advice. The government is hiding behind this cloak, oh, the national interest, oh, negotiations, oh, security. This is nothing to do with it. What I am illustrating here with these legal arguments is that there are alternative views that need to be fully discussed so that we can take the right decision on the withdrawal agreement in full knowledge of the facts. And what we've had is a doctored version which is politically spun in the interest of the government getting its objectives through. And they're protecting themselves by saying, oh, well, it might be national security, MI5, the public interest, etc., etc. I do have a great support, I must say, for the Father of the House's suggestion that if there were such problems with national security, and that those could be redacted and we can see the full legal advice. And I think this motion, in essence, focuses clearly on the legal advice provided by the Attorney General on the EU withdrawal agreement. And implicit in that, in my interpretation, is that we obviously don't need to have lots of details about MI5, national security, etc., and the negotiating position. What we want to know is what is the legal position in respect of Article 50? What is the legal position in respect of the illegalities during the referendum, making the advisory referendum flawed and therefore undermining the very power that the Prime Minister has under the EU Withdrawal Act, which is based in the advice of the referendum we now find is flawed. None of this is brought towards the House. Why? Either because the Attorney General and his colleagues are incompetent, or that they're withholding that information. I will give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. And the point he makes about national interest and public interest, and this government hiding behind that, and also claiming to be the final arbiter of public interest. Would he agree with me that they are not the final arbiter of public interest, despite what some on the opposite benches may think? And when it comes to public interest, is it a case of this UK government governing in secret over the members of this House having all of the information to make a proper and educated decision?
Yes, that's precisely what this House wants is the complete legal arguments on either side of the arguments. These are difficult issues, we all accept that, we're all grown up, on this EU withdrawal agreement. And if it said, oh, well, there's all these things about national interest and negotiation and security, people aren't interested in that. We want the full facts. And I'm simply made some simple illegal points that show the full